Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, De-risking DCTs with Quality Systems. I'm Lisa Henderson, the Group Editorial Director of Applied Clinical Trials, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are pleased to bring you this webcast presented by Applied Clinical Trials and sponsored by Research Professionals. I would now like to share a statement from our sponsor. Research Professionals, or RP, is a leading GCP-compliant CRO based in Hungary with operations in Poland, Czechia, Romania, and Bulgaria, serving customers from across Europe and the globe. Research Professional CRO, or RP-CRO, delivers efficient, flexible, and high-quality GCP-compliant CRO services, leveraging its extensive network of highly experienced principal investigators and their large local subject pools to accelerate study enrollment for a wide range of study types. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit those questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your video player. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small icon in the bottom right corner of the media player, and your slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the question mark help widget in the top right of your presentation window. And I would now like to introduce today's speaker. We are pleased to be joined today by György Barta. György is the Clinical Operations Director of Research Professionals and has spent over 20 years in clinical operations in both CRO and pharmaceutical company environments after having graduated as a pharmacist in Hungary. He has taken roles of increasing responsibility in the CRO industry, starting as a clinical research associate, progressing to local regional project management, and a full-service global study manager in clinical phases 2 and 3. In his current role, Dr. Barta is responsible for the operational oversight of RP-CRO's clinical study programs for their biotech, pharma, and medical device clients, as well as home care research nursing activities for Research Professionals' DCT operations. So thank you all for joining us today. György, could you get us started?
Hello and welcome to our webinar where we will talk about de-risking decentralized clinical trials with quality systems. My name is György Barta. I graduated as a pharmacist and have been in the clinical research industry for 20 years now in different roles of increasing responsibility. I started as a CRA, then progressed in clinical operations manager roles. I was managing studies on local, regional, and global level. I worked in both small and large organizations. In today's remote world, my goal is to always consider the people behind the emails or computer. About Research Professionals, our company, we are a leading regional CRO in Central Eastern Europe, operating in EU member countries. The company was founded 8 years ago. We have several strengths. Fast enrollment is one among them. The CE region is a reliable area to conduct clinical trials. It has been proven by data from FDA inspections as well. In today's webinar, I would like to talk to you about decentralized clinical trials. What are they? We will compare DCTs with regular clinical studies, why the industry is moving to DCTs, how to address any fears, challenges. I will present a case study where quick startup times were essential, and I intend to give you a summary at the end. Let's define what a decentralized clinical trial is. A decentralized clinical trial, or DCT, is where some or many or even all study activities occur outside the clinical site or center. That is why we call it decentralized. We use today's available technology, for example, telemedicine or in-person interactions with local nurses or physicians. Basically, in DCTs, we bring the clinical study to the patient or study participant, and it is not him or her having to visit the hospital or other medical facility to be able to participate in a clinical trial. The subject can stay at home or have a visit conducted in their workplace, avoiding travel with its associated risks and waiting times. What are the differences if we compare conventional studies with decentralized clinical trials? The location in a conventional clinical study is happening at the clinical study site. For a DCT, it can be conducted in alternative locations like subject's home or workplace, or for young subjects even in their school. The conventional clinical studies are conducted by PI, sub-investigators, and clinical nursing staff at the site. In a decentralized clinical trials, the home nurses can be trained in clinical studies, and they can have access to PIs remotely, or we can also have some physicians visit the patients in their homes. The protocol for a conventional clinical study is designed for an in-clinic conduct. However, a protocol for a decentralized clinical trial has the in-home option built in. The visits happening directly in person at the clinical sites, but in decentralized clinical trials, these visits can be in-person visits or visits with remote monitoring technologies. The logistics of the conventional clinical studies involve on-site administration of all procedures. All IMP is delivered to the site and administered locally at the clinical site to the patients. However, in a decentralized clinical trial, there are different options. One example is that direct-to-patient option, that a courier delivers the IMP to the patient's home, or the nurse can deliver the investigational medicinal product and administer it at the patient's home as well. For oversight of the patient, everything is happening at the clinical study sites in a conventional study. And for a decentralized clinical trial, we have to oversee many locations, including the patient's home. Home nursing option in a DCT can bring flexibility in the investigational medicinal product administration. There are different options. Per-os and subcutaneous IMPs can be self-administered by the patient. The home nurse can train or supervise the patient in administering the subcutaneous injections. Also, the nurses can administer intravenous injections or infusions, or intramuscular injections too, based on the approved protocol. There were several examples previously which we conducted. Even unblinded IP preparation and blinded administration of an intravenous infusion could be performed at the patient's home. In this case, two nurses were needed, one unblinded who prepared the IP and one blinded who administered it to the patient. We have different options for logistics. The nurse can deliver the IMP to the patient in controlled conditions from the pharmacy or the site, or the IMP can be delivered by a courier with the direct-to-patient setup. There are solutions available where a lockable fridge is installed at the patient's home. At the first visit of the nurse, the fridge is delivered by the courier and installed. The IMP is then delivered and stored in the fridge, and only the nurse can open it with a code. The fridge is equipped with a temperature monitoring device and can provide alerts in case of a temperature excursion as well. Why decentralized clinical trials become more popular? With the appearance of telemedicine, researchers received a new tool where they can conduct many assessments remotely. The subject's expectation is that if they attend a telemedicine visit or video call, they do not need to go to the site for an in-person visit. The subjects are becoming familiar with online technology. Many elderly are active smartphone users, so telemedicine can be widely adopted. Telemedicine visit result in time savings for the subjects, as they can avoid the travel and waiting times. Also, the subjects indicated that if they saw another fellow using telemedicine, they are more likely to try it. We had a COVID-19 study where telemedicine was an integral part of the study protocol, as the infected patients could not attend site visit due to quarantine. Decentralized clinical trials could also be implemented as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also had studies with COVID-19 indication where the patient could not visit the site, but the home nurse could visit the patient with appropriate precautions using personal protective equipment. Even blood draws were possible in this case. For non-COVID indications, implementing the home nursing option for a clinical trial ensured the study continuity and provided flexibility for the patients who did not want or could not travel to the investigator sites. Patients who participated in a clinical trial with home nursing option reported that study participation was less burdensome for them, and they were more likely to stay in the study on long term as well. Let's see what other advantages we have in a decentralized clinical trial. We can continuously monitor the subject's condition with remote monitoring technologies. There are many variables which we can track vital signs with, activities or blood sugar levels of the patients. We are capable of compliance monitoring with digital tools. There is a device, for example, which can count tablets taken from a blister, or we have e-diaries which can remind the patient on IP intake, and actual IP intake is reported in the e-diary as well. We reduce the burden on sites with decentralized clinical trials. In many cases, sites are overloaded, and if some activities can be taken off their shoulders, they can focus on more important matters of the clinical trial and management of their patients. As the travel costs shift from the subject to the home nurses, the administration related to the reimbursement of expenses is reduced at the site level as well. DCTs bring flexibility. With trained home nurses, we can start the DCT rapidly. Also, patients living further away from the clinical sites have more possibility to join a clinical trial. Now let's see the potential different challenges in relation to decentralized clinical trials and what solutions we can offer for them. I will address these in the next section. The first challenge is the environment. The environmental conditions can vary in between patients' homes versus a clinical site. Also, there is limited equipment available at the patient's home. How do we address this challenge? We can design the study to minimize impact of the environment. The protocol can be adjusted, the data point frequency, the collection of data or IP administration can be adjusted accordingly to match the home-based design. IP administration in a patient's home twice daily can allow the patient to go back to work versus spending an entire day at the hospital. In this study, we had the home nurse visiting the patient in the morning and in the evening, and the patient could still be active and did not have to spend a full day at the hospital. For data monitoring aspects, the daily lab sampling for 14 consecutive days in an oncology trial was made possible. In a home care setting, the patients could go back to work and they didn't have to spend 2 weeks in the hospital. From a quality perspective, we introduced the role of nurse coordinators in decentralized clinical trials who provide an extra layer of support for quality. They provide close oversight of the nursing activities, and they support the nurses for any questions or challenges they have. And in decentralized clinical trials, we can use the digital communication tools to allow frequent interactions with the patients, but in a non-intrusive manner. The next challenge is around subject compliance. We think, or people who are not familiar with decentralized clinical trials think that subject compliance can only be measured during the clinical visits. We have the challenges for older patients who are less technically savvy, and they could have some difficulties with remote technologies or digital tools. Within DCTs, we can address these challenges. We can increase the home visit frequency to support more these populations. We can have video calls with the patients, and trained nurses can support the patients at home visits. We had an example where monitoring of breathing had to be done 24 hours before randomization. In this case, the nurse could visit the patient and attach the device on the previous day. So the patient was compliant with the study, and they collected the data for 24 hours and could spend the previous day at home and had to attend the clinical site only for randomization. Also, the elderly population is now getting familiar with smartphones to keep contact with their family. A telemedicine visit is not really different from a standard video call. But also the nurse present at the patient's home can help support the use of these digital devices for these elderly patients. We can also have some challenges around the nurse trainings. Many nurses are not trained to conduct clinical studies, or many home nurses are not really familiar with clinical studies themselves. If we need to train a lot of staff, the training process can slow down the launch of a study. And also PI's interaction with these nurses who are unknown to them, they can lack of trust with these field nurses, but we can address these challenges as well. If we provide comprehensive training for the nurses on the clinical study requirements in advance and on regular basis, we can increase their knowledge on clinical trials. We also have different various research nurse models. We can provide trained nurses on staff who can be available 100%, so full-time hired nurses who can start tomorrow and hit the ground running in a new clinical trial right away. We are hiring flexible, detailed-oriented nurses for DCTs, so there is a selected nurse population who can conduct the clinical trials. And we really aim to document the clinical study trainings of the nurses. So a research nurse contract with us is really important factor, and we hire highly trained nurses, and we build the trust with the principal investigators by introducing these nurses to them. Also, if we have full-time nurses or permanent nurses on our staff, this will help us start a clinical trial in short times and with lower staff turnover. Some principal investigators have some fears of engaging with the home nurse. They think that they will lose control of the subject's management and that they do not trust a home nurse who is not directly part of their team. In our model, we do establish a living contact between the nurses and site staff. There is a possibility for the PI to select from several nurses, of course, if more are available in the region. And we can have an introductory meeting to get to know each other. The nurse reports to the site throughout the study. They send a detailed source document to the site after the home visit. The site would receive a well-trained nurse to their team, and they can still follow the patient with current remote technologies as well, so they don't lose contact with the patient. Next challenge is about remote or off-site visit technologies. With some of the current tools, we lose the in-person interaction for site staff, and it is challenging to monitor patient compliance and diagnose subjects remotely. Sometimes there are also issues with patient diary access, but we are addressing these with the use of wearables and digital remote monitoring technologies. We have tools available now which can count and help the patient in medication dispensing as well. Video calls are there to have a direct contact with the subject, so we can still keep the contact with the patient without an in-person interaction. There are remote data collection technologies to automate and accelerate the process, so the patient data is coming directly from these devices to the databases. Also, electronic patient diaries, if they are designed well and capture the information properly, they can be a really good tool for data collection and also to increase compliance of the patients with IMP intakes. What else we can do in terms of quality-driven solutions? We can really incorporate these digital technologies into the processes and into the protocols. So a well-designed protocol considers the home nursing option, and it is built around that. And with electronic patient diaries becoming more and more popular, these can extract medicine compliance data as well, how the patient is complying with the IMP intake, and it can also provide reminders for the patient. And electronic patient diaries also capture endpoint data for the patients via questionnaires administered by the patients themselves. How can we ensure study compliance? Investigator staff and also the industry has some fears how we can maintain the clinical study design in decentralized clinical trial, how we can meet the expectations of the regulatory authorities and ethics committees, how we can conduct research in an ethical manner. We do have robust processes in decentralized clinical trials. Also, these can be audited as well, and to check compliance with the protocol, the study-specific processes. Findings of these audits and inspections helped us to improve our processes. An example finding was about delegation of tasks and PI oversight. This helped to fine-tune the process to get the PIs more involved in the selection of the nurses. Our nurse coordinators also trained the site staff on how to collaborate with the home nurses to dispense IMP to them or to receive the source document and biological samples taken at the patient's home, which the nurse delivers to the site. Some other challenges regarding data integrity. We are generating data in subjects' homes, how these get transferred to the databases, how the data protection is ensured when we collect data outside the clinical site can be a challenge. We have different options available here as well. The sites can transmit subject data to the sponsor in the same way as previously, but we also have the subject data transmitted to the site in a new way. We can transfer this data with home nursing applications. These are run from a dedicated company smartphone of the research nurse, so in a protected environment. Also, we can send encrypted documents which also increase data security. We can apply electronic signatures as well, which provide the validity of the data. And we need to train the site staff as well, how to transmit the data and the information. We can also conduct regular internal audits, and we do develop systems and tools which are compliant with GCP and the clinical trial protocol to ensure integrity of the study data. In general, if we design a quality system which supports the specific needs of the decentralized clinical trials, we can address many of these perceptions and challenges, and the decentralized clinical trials can be conducted in full compliance with regulatory requirements as well. What other measures we have available, how we can support a decentralized clinical trial with quality systems? We can provide manuals to the nursing staff, source documentation templates, which helps them complete this information easier at the patient's home when they collect the data. We can provide them checklists for the study activities so they don't miss any steps of the process. The nurse coordinators can provide close oversight of the nurse activities. Also, the source documents which are generated at the patient's home and transferred to the sites are also quality checked by the nurse coordinators, so the site receives a good quality source documentation from the nurses. Also, if we manage off-site visits and research nursing activities remotely, there is close interaction between the nurse and the nurse coordinator. We also think about subject privacy and confidentiality processes. So all these processes are built with having these rules in mind, including GDPR. We have worked on processes to escalate any issues. We also need to do some change management for the clinical sites to accept decentralized clinical trials, but once they try it and see it works and it is compliant, they are more likely to choose a decentralized clinical trial as well. Also, there is a regular discussion ongoing with the regulatory authorities about decentralized clinical trials because it is a new area for everyone. Also, there is frequent sponsor and supplier audits on decentralized clinical trials to ensure quality. In our company, we also have regular contacts with the nursing staff. We engage them, we continuously providing them trainings to ensure a high quality of their work. To ensure quality, we also have different nursing options or nursing models available. We have different strategies. It's important that we select and pre-screen the nurses before we contract them. We also conduct several trainings to them about clinical trials in general, also on decentralized clinical trials. These trainings are well documented. The nurses can attend site introductory meetings, or they can introduce themselves at the site initiation visit. Also, they can provide trainings for the on-site staff, or even our nurse coordinators can provide some trainings to the on-site staff on the interactions with the nurse, how to work with them, what do we expect from the sites as well. Some processes are different for the site staff as well. As I mentioned, they need to receive the samples, for example, from a nurse visiting the subject and send them to the central lab. And they would also need to dispense IMP for a research nurse, for example, who is visiting the patient at home. So these interactions we need to train the site staff on as well. And we also provide study-specific equipment to the home research nurses. In some cases, as we mentioned before, at the patient's home, there are no clinical equipment available, basically. So the home nurse can deliver the centrifuges, ECGs, and blood drawing materials to the patient's home to conduct the visit there. For the HR strategies, we have different options as well. We can have a retain model, which means that several nurses are hired full-time and they are allocated to the site, so they can be available 24/7. But we also have project-based model where we identify and train nurses who are also delegated by the site in the delegation of authority log, and they are awarded or rewarded by hourly fees after their work conducted at the patient's home. And now I would like to present you a case study where we developed our processes and implemented a switch of a conventional study to a decentralized clinical trial in a very short period of time. This study was a pediatric psychiatric study. We had 2 ongoing traditional in-clinic study protocols when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And the sponsor had 2 options basically: to terminate these studies because patient visits at the sites were not possible, or to do something else and transition quickly to a DCT model. The aim was to continue the studies to completion without loss of quality or compliance. In this study, our strategy was that we already had developed processes and systems to manage decentralized clinical trials. We had the experience as well. We also have established data collection tools for off-site visits, and we already had the qualified staff available who can conduct home visits. In this study, we really had rapid startup timelines. In 17 business days, we could have the first patient visit after the first contact from the study sponsor. We also went through vendor qualification process and contracting in this short amount of time. And we could offer the client that patient visits could continue during the COVID-19 pandemic, despite the travel restrictions and quarantine requirements. And we could continue the study, and there was no loss of data or quality for the study, as they could switch to the decentralized clinical trial model. Now I would like to summarize the decentralized clinical trial advantages, what we can provide to the patients. It's really and sites and clients. For the clients, it means easier patient recruitment and higher retention rates. As mentioned before, once a patient enters decentralized clinical trials and experiences the home visits, they are more likely to stay in the study. It is convenient for the subjects because of this. We have flexible options as well. We can have patients who are living far from the clinical study sites participating in clinical studies because the home nurses can reach them. And in decentralized clinical trials, we can still ensure quality, and we can ensure data collection. It's important that we develop processes, systems, and infrastructure to ensure the quality of these studies. If we pre-train nurses of clinical studies in home settings, they are likely to conduct the study activities in quality without data loss. We can also build trust and confidence of the principal investigators. Also, if we design a quality system which is in line with the regulatory requirements and ethical considerations, we can ensure and minimize the risks inherent to decentralized clinical trials. It is really important that we train the staff who is part of the decentralized clinical trials, and our case study also demonstrated that we can provide advantages of the decentralized clinical trial without loss of quality, and we could initiate rapidly the decentralized clinical trial because we had already prepared in advance. If you have any questions about this webinar, please feel free to ask and contact us later as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, George, for your informative presentation. Thank you so much. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind the audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found directly below the video player. So let's get to that Q&A. And I will just bring that up, excuse me, audience. Our first question, George, so in-home visits takes out the control of the principal investigator. So why would they trust a nurse that they've never worked with before?
I wouldn't say it takes out the control of the principal investigator's hands. I tried to give information in the presentation about this in several areas or aspects. Basically, we hire selected and filtered nurses, so it's really important that there is a thorough screening process in our system to hire nurses who can perform clinical trial visits at the patient's home. They have experience in clinical studies. We also train them very carefully. Most of them have home care experience themselves. And in their training program, we train them on general aspects like good clinical practices, GCP, or basic life support, and IATA training for the shipment of the samples, for example. And there is close supervision from the nurse coordinators in their work. So once they are at the patient's home, they can contact the nurse coordinator if they have any issues, any specific cases. They can also contact the site. So it's important that these nurses do not lose the contact with the site during the study conduct. They report to the site, they send the source documentation completed by them to the site directly. But also the PI is involved from the very beginning of the selection process of the nurses. So basically, once we have a nurse allocated to a site, previously the PI has the chance to review the nurse's CV, and we can also have the nurse go to the site for an introductory meeting to get to know each other and present themselves. So this connection can already be established from the very beginning.
Excellent. All excellent points to help develop that trust. Appreciate it. How can patient safety be assured when IMPs are given as an infusion?
Yeah, it is a concern of many. At the beginning of, or at the first decentralized clinical trials, regulatory authorities and ethics committees were a little bit worried about the conditions at the patient's home and how to administer an infusion or injection or anything intravenous in the patient's home. But since then, I think a lot of things evolved. Of course, we are doing anything which is legally possible at the patient's home. So there are specific therapies which are not allowed to be done outside the hospital settings, like several biological therapies or chemotherapy agents are not to be administered at the patient's home. But as home nursing activities are part of the clinical research protocols, we or the ethics committees and regulatory authorities review these processes and give approval to these. It's important that the home nurse stays with the patient during the infusion and after the infusion as well for the desired observation time. We have, for example, an enzyme replacement therapy study where the nurse spends more than 5 hours in the patient's home doing the infusion and observing the patient, and it's working well for several years now. And also, as I mentioned before, the nurses are trained, so if there is a medical emergency, they can act there. They can call the ambulance services if really needed, but they can also administer some drugs themselves, which they have with them, like norepinephrine or steroids. So they can also cover some acute cases as well.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question. In rare disease studies, relatively few patients can be spread. Yeah, because rare disease studies have relatively few patients. They can be spread in a large geographic area. Can in-home visits reduce the burden of the sponsors, sites, and patients?
Yes, we do think it can reduce the burden on everyone. So basically, it's a win-win situation for all parties. The sponsors will have access to patients who live further from the clinical sites. Some patients are not willing or not able to travel to the clinical sites too frequently. So it would be a good opportunity for them to stay at their homes, have the home nurse come to them and do the study visit there. Also for the sites, it would be in some cases reduction of the efforts because they can conduct some other activities. They still have the oversight as we discussed, but also some specific visits are conducted by the home nurse. So they don't need to worry about travel. The patient himself or herself does not need to worry about travel times, waiting times, so they can have the visit at their home or other convenient place. So it's good for the patient as well. And for the site, it also reduces the administration burden as well, because administering a long travel cost for the patient or organizing this as well can cause some extra activities or extra time for them, which they can avoid this way. So the home nurse would be managed by us, and all these administrative tasks can be covered as well.
Excellent, thank you. So we have a question regarding, of course, DCTs. Thanks you for your comprehensive view of DCTs. Can we conduct multi-center trials in the DCT model?
Yeah, in these specific cases which I mentioned, there are multiple centers involved. So several hospital sites are actively participating in the studies, and some aspects of the studies are conducted outside the site, so at the patient's home. So in a country, we can have several sites, like 5 to 6 or even more, and each of the sites would have their regional nurse coverage. So we aim to deploy a nurse from within 30 minutes to 1 hour each from the clinical site or from the patient's home. And so yes, the answer is yes. We can have several clinical sites be involved in such trial. There are some other models where there is like one meta site, so to speak, which has one principal investigator, and many activities are conducted virtually, so basically by telemedicine. But in other models, we can have several clinical sites be involved and still have have the nurse coverage at the patient's home or close to the patient.
Excellent, thank you, George. So your presentation was very comprehensive, and for that reason, we are going to wrap up. We appreciate the audience for attending and for participating in today's event. And I would also like to thank our sponsor, Research Professionals, for making today's educational webcast possible. Audience, please, if you would, participate in a brief survey, which will appear on your screen after we end the presentation. You will also receive an email alert which will let you know that the webcast is available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event, and you can always access that again to watch on demand. So thank you all for joining, and we will see you next time. Take care.